And now we're going to have a look at how the book launch went tonight at Liberty Hall.
America's enmity is based on historical perceptions, mostly false, towards this island of 11 million. As far back as 1820, the United States designed to control Cuba, and they succeeded in 1898 when they invaded, ostensibly, to help the rebels gain independence from the Spanish. I hope to remove some of the anonymity from these victims.
A number of years ago, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions held a conference in Dublin and invited speakers from Cuba. Arising out of that, SIP2 decided that in relation to its international campaigning, it would form a Cuban Solidarity Society. Essentially, it's made up of staff and voluntary activists who give roughly €10 a month or €100 a year to the Solidarity campaign.
Cubans are helping Haiti at the moment. They're rebuilding the Haitian health service from the grassroots up. And they've committed 10 years to entirely rebuild every part of the Haitian health system. And as part of that, we have put on functions, we've shown films, we've had talks to collect funds to donate to that effort to support the Cuban aid to Haiti.
We are now campaigning on behalf of the wives of two of those prisoners who have not had the opportunity to visit their husbands for the past 11 years in one case and 10 years in another case. While this is not a deep political campaign, it is a campaign on behalf of wives and children so that they have the basic human right to see and visit their father and their husband.
Now, one of the major reasons you're here, Keith, and we're here to talk today is your book, Voices from the Other Side, An Oral History of Terrorism Against Cuba. What is the essential concept behind this book, Keith?
Well, the idea of the book was to talk to individual Cubans, normal Cubans, not government officials or diplomatic officials, but average, everyday Cubans who have been directly affected by these acts of terrorism or who have had family or family members injured or killed by these acts of terrorism, with the intent of letting the reader know the extent and the long history of terrorism against Cuba since the beginning of the revolution. It's a topic that is more than fairly well known inside of Cuba, and there's been many books written about terrorism, the subject of terrorism in Cuba, but mostly from the political perspective and context of American policy against Cuba. This book is a series of testimonials from Cubans who have been directly affected by terrorism, and it's broken up into chapters outlining the various acts of terrorism against Cuba. So it's from a perspective of the individual much more important than the act itself.
Okay, so you would say it would be, what would differentiate this from other books on the subject is it's told from a citizen's perspective.
Absolutely. It is individual Cubans that I've talked to, and in their own words, given their experiences of being a victim of these acts of terrorism or having lost mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, sons and daughters to these acts of terrorism, letting them explain in their own words, in their own human ideas and concepts, what it's been like to have survived and suffered all these years, and in context with that, to let the reader know and understand just how extensive this war has been. Essentially,
we don't know that much about it over here. Can I attribute that to the fact that the American Free Press also, it's news and information is a commodity to be traded, and we perhaps even have a news blockade around Cuba or about Cuba?
No one outside of Cuba, very few people outside of Cuba know about the history, the extensive history of Cuba. I mean, most people are familiar, if you talk to someone about Fidel Castro, and they may be familiar with the assassination attempts against Castro. That's fairly common knowledge. But to talk about the war against the terrorist war against the Cuban people, it's almost unknown. In one of the chapters, the introduction of the book is the unknown war, simply because so few people know the extent and the amount and the number of acts of terrorism that have been committed against the Cuban people inside of Cuba.
Yeah. But of course, we wouldn't have even known about some of these acts of terrorism, but for the Senator Church Commission. I mean, and while some of the assassination attempts that we discovered from that, at times they seemed hilarious and almost Keystone Cops. They were very real and very frequent.
Very much so. And those were directed against Fidel Castro and the top government officials. I touch on that, but very, very rarely, very superficially, because the content of the book is dedicated to the Cuban individual. But yeah, the Church Commission and that's where the people get their perception of terrorism against Cuba, against government officials, which this book is not focused on.
Sure. Now, can you give us some examples of what were, if you like, terrorist acts against Cubans and against Cuba itself?
Certainly, probably the most infamous or well-known act of terrorism was the bombing of the Cuban Airlines Flight 455 in October 1976. It killed 73 people, all 73 people on board. It remains the second worst act of air terrorism in the Americas after 9/11. And that's the starting chapter of the book. And I talked to a number of people that have lost family members or friends or working associates in that act. One of them, his name is Jose de la Nuez. He's a 40-year-old office worker in Havana. He was 5 years old at the time of the terrorist act against the Cuban Airlines, and he remembers like it happened yesterday, running up, and his mother was in tears, and he was expecting his father to come home after a lengthy stay away from Cuba, and his mother was crying, and she told him what happened, and he remembers to this day how he felt betrayed that his father was punishing him by not coming home and not realizing what really happened with his father. Sure. So the Cuban airline, the act is still noted every year in Cuba. And that's the most important act of terrorism and the most famous one, but it's a very small part of all the other ones there.
And how would you connect this war on terrorism against, you call them the Cuban Five, I believe. We know them as the Miami Five in this part of the world. Tell the viewers, if you could, just what is the background to this story of what we call the Miami Five?
In Canada and in the United States, they're known as the Cuban Five. When I came over here, the indication was it's more referenced as the Miami Five. There's absolutely the direct connect. You have to understand the Cuban Five, the Miami Five, in context to the history of terrorism. If you separate the two, it makes no sense. The Cuban Five are in Miami, infiltrating counter-revolutionary terrorist organizations simply because of the long history of terrorism against Cuba, which this book connects. The last chapter of the book is on the Cuban Five, the Miami Five, and puts in context the reason why those Cuban agents were in the United States in the first place. If anyone is familiar with the case, you know, they understand the process and the situation of the Miami Five right now, still in jail, still facing very long jail terms. But again, the Cuban government's position has always been, well, they were there not to spy on the American government, and there's never been any evidence that they compromised any American government secrets. They were there to infiltrate the known anti-revolutionary, anti-Castro terrorist groups to try and thwart the potential future acts of terrorism. And you can't understand that unless you know that the history of the acts of terrorism that Cuba has faced. The Cuban government has documented over 700 acts of terrorism since 1959. There's been more than 3,500 people die from these acts and thousands more injured. So it's a response.
Sure.
A justifiable response to what the Cuban government has faced.
Yeah. And how effective actually is this blockade? Because I know that we can go a couple of 100 meters down the road here, we can buy Cuban cigars, we can buy some of the finest Havana cigars. Clearly, they get out. So I wonder, is it still as, I mean, it probably is promoted as vigorously, but are businessmen finding ways around it.
The rest of the world can trade with Cuba.
Okay.
There's no blockade for Ireland, England, Canada, Mexico, Latin America. It's the American, and the America economy is still the most dominant in the world. And it is the most internationally connected. So it has an effect when you're the neighbor. If Cuba was next to Russia, then maybe the effect wouldn't be as bad. If the United Kingdom had a blockade against Ireland, it may be a little more devastating than if Canada had an embargo against Ireland. So it's the proximity, but it's also the relationship between the United States and Cuba. And again, the blockade works both ways. The Cubans cannot access the American market.
Sure. Yeah.
It does have an effect. It has an effect on a day-to-day basis. Every time the Cubans want to purchase medical equipment, medicine, replacement parts for tractors, anything, it's amazing how their perspective changes because they know immediately they cannot access the most appropriate and the most economical market right next door. And conversely, the Americans are now starting to say, okay, enough is enough. Through Congress in particular, we want to stop this 50 years of failure. We want to access the Cuban market, and the Cuban market wants to access our markets. But my opinion is yes, the embargo still has an impact. For you and for me, we can enjoy a Cuban cigar and we can enjoy a Cuban rum, but the embargo is directed from the Americans to the Cubans. The rest of the world are not as affected, even though there is a lot of...
Were you saying before we came on air, Keith, the book is called Voices from the Other Side. It has been published by Pluto Press. Can't wait to read it, and it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Michael, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much,
immensely.
Keith Bolender.